Although the ecological crisis is not the public obsession it was 2 or 3 years ago, whatever it is that was then happening to our soil, our skies, our air, and our water is still happening to a greater or lesser degree. We hope to establish here today, among other things. Barry Commoner was never a doomsayer in the style of, say, the Sierra Club, but his analysis was nonetheless implacable. He figured we had to spend in contemporary dollars about $50 billion per year over the next generation in order to win back the good graces of the ecosphere. Dr. Commoner was born in New York, went to Columbia, and took his advanced degrees in Harvard. He came then here to St. Louis, to Washington University, where his research in physiochemistry got him much renown. He is now the director of the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems. His first book, Science and Survival, published in 1966, was widely noticed, and his second, The Closing Circle, was universally admired and earned him the reputation of father of ecology, a position which I suppose we must reluctantly concede is itself biodegradable. Mr. Commoner's anxiety to retune America to the cosmic scale causes him to prescribe rather imperiously on matters of political and economic policy in which he is perhaps not as experienced as he is in biology. I am anxious to probe his ecological conclusions, of course, but also to speculate on whether his prescriptions necessarily follow from that analysis. I'd like to begin by asking Professor Commoner whether, since the writing of his book, The Closing Circle, there have been any developments that, for better or worse, affect his theses.
Well, there have been some developments, most of them for the worse. When I wrote the book, Mr. Nixon was putting himself forward as perhaps the George Washington of ecology. He's backed off pretty far from that. I think largely because he's begun to recognize that it's not a motherhood issue, that if we have to pay the debt to nature, it will make a difference who pays. There have been improvements, most of them local. So, for example, Suffolk County, Long Island, has banned detergents. The phosphate in the Detroit River is running lower than it was because the city of Detroit banned phosphates in detergents. I think the further away you get from the federal government, the more action there is.
Well, now, it is, as I understand it, we are spending, in the 50th of Nixon's term, approximately 4 times what we were spending on ecology at the beginning of his term, and 15 times as much on the matter of water pollution alone. Your point is that we should be, of course, spending many times that much more.
Oh, yes, yes.
Now, Nixon was supposed to have understood the issue in a sense that, what, Lyndon Johnson could not have been expected to understand it?
No, I didn't say that. I was comparing Nixon's statements about the environmental issue that he made in the State of the Union message in 1970 with his actions since. He made a pretty good speech. They were good words. He recognized that it was now or never, I'm quoting, that we owe a debt to nature, that we have to really exert ourselves to roll back environmental pollution. And since then, I think he's rapidly backed away from carrying out the rather good laws that Congress has enacted. So, for example, one of the most important legislative steps has been the legal provision for environmental impact statements, requirement that every action the federal government takes has to be spelled out with respect to its environmental consequences. This is terribly important because until now we've been flying blind. Well, one of the things that I think Mr. Nixon's been doing is trying to get around that. For example, he's had a bill introduced to allow the Atomic Energy Commission to evade or not use the environmental impact statement. And I think that would be very unfortunate.
What do you suppose his motives are?
I don't know.
Well, you can
at this point, I think Mr. Nixon's motives is something that neither you nor I can probably guess at.
Well, but I'm sure you don't feel any reluctance to speculate about his motives, do you?
Oh, I am reluctant. I think it's much better to let him, shall we say, confront his actions rather than my providing motives as an excuse.
Well, could it be that since it is a democratic country, and some people are, for instance, concerned about imminent shortages of energy, there is pressure on him to continue to encourage progress, for instance, through atomic energy to take care of our power needs in the years to come?
Yeah, that's an interesting situation. The energy situation, I think, reveals, you know, if I were writing the closing circle today, I think I would use the energy situation as kind of the cutting edge, because it revealed some of the basic issues in a sharp way. First, everything that our society can do depends on energy. I mean, this is well known. And yet we are in a situation in which we are running short of energy in the short term, and will certainly in the next generation, and yet we don't have a policy. And so we have a society which has done nothing really to establish the way in which it's going to acquire, so to speak, its own lifeblood.
Mm-hmm.
And the immediate situation is one which I think is, you know, if it weren't so serious, would be funny. For example, we are now told that the oil companies are short of oil. And the excuse that's given is that they weren't aware that there would be such a reduction in gas mileage, that is mileage per gallon, as a result of the numerous air conditioners that have gone into cars and the size of cars.
And the anti-pollution devices.
Right. Now, all of this burns gasoline to no purpose, really. Now, I would guess that a moderately competent high school sophomore working for an oil company would have known, let's say 3 years ago, that a few judicious telephone calls to the manufacturers of air conditioners for cars and to the designers of the cars would have predicted that in this year there would be thus and so many new cars with extra gas-burning devices. And the prediction could have been made as to how much gasoline was going to be consumed.
Well, you obviously have to reject your guess because both of us know, if not by experience, at least by postulation, that there are people in the oil companies who are brighter than 12-year-old grammar school students.
Well, then what's the alternative? That they knew about it and weren't telling us?
That you guess wrong. Or that there were developments, for instance, that they couldn't anticipate. Or the oil companies to have anticipated that 5 years after the discovery of the North Slope, it would not yet have been possible to start a pipeline across northern Alaska?
Well, of course, that would have had nothing to do with the availability of oil right now. Oh, it would have taken more than that to get the line built.
Well, it would take more than 5 years, but...
Well, and actually, it would have been a good idea for them to anticipate that there might be some difficulties in doing something that's never been done on the history of the Earth before. It'd be pretty arrogant of them to think they're going to lay down the first pipeline carrying oil over the permafrost with no problems at all.
No, I should think they would have anticipated problems, but I don't think that anybody really anticipated the dilemma that, in fact, we seem to be wrestling with. On the one hand, we want something. On the other hand, we're not prepared to pay the cost of it. I certainly wish that they did have a more effective policy, and I wish that a lot of policies were more conducive to the discovery of oil. But in point of fact, as we both know, there is no shortage of energy for the time being.
For the time being.
Yeah.
But you see, it's perfectly clear that we are going to run out of petroleum and natural gas. And it's absolutely essential that we change the way in which we use our energy in preparation for that. And it takes very little to see that we're wasting a large part of the energy that we use. The classic example is the matter of freight. Now, the social good of freight is something that's, you don't need to debate. What you want is something delivered. And it really doesn't make any difference to you whether your refrigerator is delivered by truck or by rail. And yet, if it's delivered by truck, intercity truck, it will require 6 times as much fuel as it would by railroad, which means 6 times as much petroleum consumed and 6 times as much air pollution. And yet what has been happening in this country, and this is being accelerated by administration policy, is that we are displacing rail traffic with truck traffic. Now take the ridiculous thing that's been proposed for the Penn Central. Here is major traffic carrier on the East Coast, absolutely essential to the life of the country. It's in bankruptcy, and the administration, Mr. Bernegar, has proposed that the trackage be stripped down to a very small fraction which can be run at a profit, turned over then to a new private company to run at a profit, and the rest of the trackage discarded, which means that that freight will have to be carried by truck, which will exacerbate the fuel shortage 6-fold for every shift that's made. I mean, it's a completely ridiculous situation.
Well, your temptation, and rather consistent, I think, Dr. Commoner, is to feel that the best way to adjust a situation, to meet your own anxieties, is simply to tell people what to do and to simply annul the free market decision. Now, if you want to stop people from burning up unnecessary fuel, there's an obvious way to do it, which is simply to forbid them to drive their cars except on business. But this being a libertarian society, we tend to resist these
Well,
easy
that's a
solutions.
pretty simplistic...
I know. I'm trying to show you how to save fuel. If in point of fact somebody wants a refrigerator and it can be delivered for $210 by truck, but $225 by rail, they're going to do it until you tell them it's unconstitutional or whatever it is.
Well, I have perhaps more faith in people. See, let me put it this way. Suppose that, let's make the situation much more difficult. Take cars, because there, you know, there's more than just the value of getting from here to there and buying a car. And people buy Cadillacs because they want the social status, so on, that goes with it. Don't you suppose that if there were a red sticker on the Cadillac, you know, next to the price and so on, which said this car burns so much gasoline per mile and pollutes the environment so and so much more than a smaller car, don't you suppose that'll have some effect on people? I think that most people are not fully aware of the impact of what they do on the environment. And I think that once they're aware, they'll take this into account much more than they are now.
Well, I think that may be true. I have enough faith in people to believe that the average Cadillac buyer does know that it burns more fuel than, say, a Volkswagen. But my approach to the problem tends to be different from your own. If it is, I think, the responsibility of a society to instruct the individual in the social cost of any mechanism that it sells them. When you buy a car, there is an implicit commitment of other people to buy roads for you to drive your car over. And we try to work that datum in by taxes on gasoline. Now, we are moving towards a more critical situation. The way, surely, to adjust to it is to tax horsepower, which is, in fact, what they came up with in Europe 25 years ago, which is one of the reasons why you see many more Volkswagens in Germany, not so much because people can't afford higher-priced cars.
Yeah, that's one way of doing it. But when you get to something like the Penn Central situation, a very serious question is raised, because here we're using an economic parameter to determine the way in which we use our resources. And I think this raises a very serious question as to whether a social good, such as the petroleum that we have, is to be governed by the short-term interests of, well, essentially the Nixon administration.
Well, now, come on. There's no reason to suppose that Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, both of whom capitulated to the railroads...
Oh, well, now, look, I refuse to...
If you're going to use Nixon as synecdoche, say so. If you're going to use him because this is the day after Watergate, let's forget it.
No. Let's not have the full scope of American politics
given
by Nixon, Kennedy, and Johnson. You know, they're we've got lots of people around. And I think there are people, Senator Harris impresses me as one such, who have begun to emphasize the social possessions of the country. You see, that's the thing about the environment. The environment doesn't belong to anyone. There's no way of doing that. There's no way of distributing the air in parcels so that it can be subject to a commodity exchange between individuals. There's no way of having something as complex and as interwoven become subject to economics which are based on individual interests.
Actually, there is.
Invented.
Well, no, I'll tell you how. As a matter of fact, you make the point rather tellingly in your book that whereas most people feel that the ecological crisis is a result of an increase in population, it isn't at all. You've instructed us all that the ecological blight went from the figure of 200 to the figure 2,200, while the population rose only 42%. I begin with the following assumption, that nature does provide opportunity for a certain amount of waste. That you can understand that there is an enormous garbage disposal vat available to any society. It's when it spills over that you've got problems.
Oh, no. Did you read my book?
I've read enough of it.
No, look, I spent a good deal of time getting across the idea that ecological systems work in cycles, circles.
Yeah.
Now, in a circle, there is no such thing as waste. There is no vat. Everything moves through. There are no vats. See, the one excuse that people sometimes give is that...
Well, there certainly is, as
there's no dumping ground.
Exhaust. For instance, if there are only 2 automobiles in America, the exhaust could be easily handled by the skies and the winds, right?
This is not really handled, simply spread around.
Well, spread around.
Spread around.
So
right.
There were a lot more than 2 cars before 1945, and you can see that there wasn't much of a problem then.
Yeah.
Is this going to synthetics and all these non-biodegradable stuff that you worry about?
And the fact that the cars were converted into smog generators by being built into high horsepower and high compression engines.
Well, but even then, before 1945, there were more than 20 million cars in this country.
Right.
And you weren't disturbed. Now,
no, there was practically
therefore there was in effect a vat into which 20 million cars were able to.
Allow me to instruct you.
Sure.
Look, what the book says is that before the war, those cars were not putting out nitrogen oxides because they were operating at low pressure, low temperature, therefore. And that's why we had no smog, because it's nitrogen oxides that trigger off the smog. If we were all driving pre-war cars now, there would be no smog. In other words, there wasn't anything being dissipated. Yes, the carbon monoxide, but let's just take the business of smog. That was triggered by nitrogen oxides. There simply weren't enough nitrogen oxides disseminated to cause smog before the war. After the war, we got smog because the engines simply produced it. Now, I don't want to belabor the point, but the fact is that we've got to realize that the environment is a closed system. There is no sink, and there is no way, really, of getting rid of anything. True, you can spread it around to the point where you can't smell the odors and where there may be an unmeasurable effect, but it isn't a vat that gets filled up. It's simply a system in which material is spread around, and if you spread the wrong thing around in it, you begin to break down the system.
Well, it is a 400-year-old insight that matter cannot be changed, only transformed, and if that's what you're saying, I understand.
Yeah, right.
But it's also true that X number of people can go ahead and do something which double X number of people can't do without obviously deleterious effects. The fact that a single person uses detergent in a town is something that we can accept without it disturbing anybody, even though intrinsically your generality is correct, that detergent is not something that goes back into the cycle. Whence my vat notion that what one needs to do is to interfere with the marketplace through discrete but impartial taxation, such that the VAT ceases to overflow.
Well, the business of taxation, I think, it's a favorite these days. But, you know, it's going to be pretty tricky. If you tax horsepower, that's one thing. But in effect, we're taxing cars by unit, by the price that's attached to the control device that's added on. You know, next year...
I'm proposing the other.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
proposing
Well,
the other.
that would be, that certainly would be better.
If somebody wants a Cadillac so badly that he's prepared to pay 3 times the cost of it, my notion is that he is buying at a very considerable expense a few cubic inches in that VAT. And so long as you keep the rates flexible enough to see to it that the whole does not overflow, you're heading in the right direction. Why couldn't we, for instance, move in the direction of the pre-war car so that we could have simply the carbon monoxide problem, not the nitrogen problem?
I think we could. And as a matter of fact, the recent hearings on the EPA standards simply placed the issue right in front of Detroit. You know, the Honda people turned up with an engine which operated at low temperatures. It's essentially a way of reducing the temperature of the explosion so that it did not produce nitrogen oxides. And when the Detroit companies complained that they couldn't retool in time, and I kind of wonder about that because they retooled mighty fast during World War II when we needed to make tanks. But nevertheless...
They didn't care about a deficit.
Right.
Because the government simply took the deficit.
Exactly. And then the Honda people offered to sell them cylinder heads to put on the Vega engine that would convert it. And the interesting question arises as to why Detroit is not in a position to do that kind of retooling.
What are its motives?
That's right.
You want to speculate on its motives?
No, why don't you speculate on its motives?
Well, I should think probably that they run into a series of scientific obstacles that you're not willing to concede. It's funny that you as a man of science should be
but
rather...
These obstacles didn't arise in Japan.
Well, no, well, Japan...
Science is international. We always say that.
I have considerable respect for the ingenuity of Japan, but if I were to ask Japan to please deliver me 60 million engine heads, whatever you call them, tomorrow, I'm not absolutely certain they could do it.
Well, they may have been talking big, but actually, you know, I think they were ready to do it, you know.
Well, it seems to be plain that if we were sitting here exclusively concerned for the best interest of General Motors and forgetting the old identification between their interests and the nation's, we would reason over to the future of the situation. The future situation is one in which fuel will be scarce, in which the air will be clogged, in which there will be very considerable resentment against the sources of these dissatisfactions. And under the circumstances, I should think that anybody who was inventive enough to contribute to penetrating these problems would be worth a great deal of money as an employee of GM.
Right.
I think that you've got a sort of a hobgoblinized view of businessmen.
You were the one who speculated.
Well, I'm not speculating about what you think.
Yeah. Well, I am simply interested in the question of whether the auto companies are going to be in an economic position to drastically turn over essentially a generation of engineering development and do it differently. You see, they simply headed off in the wrong direction. What they should have done is simply made a super efficient Model T, or let's say a Model A. You know, one that didn't burn less and less gasoline, that was convenient, so on. That's the direction in which they should have moved. They didn't. And now, what does it take to redo the whole technological direction of the industry?
Presumably...
You think they can hack it?
Presumably, it takes the alternative of starvation. And if in fact it becomes a matter of social policy to forbid people to drive cars that emit more than X number of whatever you call it, then they have to adjust or simply go out of business.
Of course, the thing that worries me is that the adjustments have been the other way. You know, there was a very interesting development right after the hearings on the emission standards. Just a week later, Mr. Ruckelshaus went before the Muskie Committee to testify on air pollution standards. And he said that they had decided that the nitrogen oxide levels were too stringent and that they should be reduced. Now, what that will in effect do is wipe out the whole need for the 1975 standards that had been debated the week before.
Well, they may have been not feasible.
Well, it would have been, I think, more illuminating to the citizen to tie the two together in the previous hearings so that it was made clear.
Well, but it may very well have been that they didn't have the practical experience to be able to do that. If I were to give you the powers of Napoleon and say, please clean me up Lake Erie by next fall, I doubt that even you could manage it.
I wouldn't even try.
There you are.
Right.
There you are. So it may very well be that all of the technology of Detroit is not sufficient to meeting standards that were rather abstractly
Right.
promulgated several years ago.
Well, and of course, what we're talking about is the basic dilemma, and that is that Detroit, and the rest of industry, has the power to get us into trouble, but not the power to get us out of it.
Well, the function of Detroit is to appeal to the consumer, if
That's your speculation.
Well, that's not my speculation. That is the way it works. After all, Edsel did not appeal to the consumer, and that was the end of Edsel. And under the circumstances, they obviously follow laws having to do with safety and other factors that are set down by society. Now, if you say the same consumers who patronize Detroit, who are asking them for this kind of a creature, whereas they should know as much as the students of Dr. Kalmer and ask for different kinds of things, would therefore sponsor legislation that would bring them in that direction, then I say that this is something that we ought to confront. And maybe that's what we're doing here.
Oh, sure, sure. But you know, the business of advertising has to be taken into account. When I was writing The Closing Circle, I ran across a fascinating book on the English detergent industry. And it was everything from chemistry to advertising. And a very fine book, had data in it. And there was a set of graphs which plotted the expenditures of different brands of detergents in England for advertising, and concurrently their sales. And sure enough,
Was there a correlation?
well, yes, you'd see an increased expenditure for a particular detergent and increased sales. And of course, the standard argument is, well, we're getting our wares across, and people realize it's a good thing, and so they buy it. But then what you also see is that when, for some reason, the expenditures drop, so do sales. And so the argument that people
You mean the advertising drops?
Yes, the advertising expenditure drops. And it's pretty clear that the market is being created by advertising rather than by the value of the product.
Well, but it doesn't follow. Because after all, Edsel advertised ferociously and people resisted it. It may very well be that that there is a correlation between advertising and the satisfying quality of that which is advertised. Otherwise, it would be as simple as this: whoever advertises most is going to, in all situations, sell more.
By and large, it's true, isn't it?
Well, I'd like to know why there's less advertising now as a percentage of GNP than there was in 1920. It's because a lot of people have discovered the limits of advertising.
You know, one of the things I was interested in doing during
Cigarettes
writing,
is an excellent example.
is an interesting point here. I keep asking economists various simple-minded questions, and one of the questions I've been asking is, how do you measure the relative profitability of different industries? And there are all kinds of numbers. And finally, one of them insisted that the simplest way to get a measure of the relative standing of different industries in terms of profitability is just see what proportion of their income they use for advertising. The more advertising they do, the higher the rate of return. Now, I'm not going to propose that that's authentic, but this was a suggestion made to me here by someone at the business school. It's kind of interesting.
I think
Railroads don't advertise much.
I think it's a little eccentric. Yeah, I think it's a little eccentric. It has a lot to do with whether the demand is elastic or inelastic.
Right.
Yeah. But let me before going to your rather revolutionary political proposals, ask you, if I may, briefly to explain what you propose as regards to the four major problems as you identify them. You talk about replacing synthetic materials by natural ones. This means what? That you would outlaw the use of synthetic materials?
Now, let's be careful about using the terms would outlaw. I wouldn't do anything.
That's why I wanted you to correct me.
Right.
Yeah.
What I said in the closing circle, and what I keep saying, is this, that we've got to look at the relative impact on the environment of equally valuable goods made out of natural material on the one hand and synthetic material on the other. Take cotton and nylon. Both can be used to produce a shirt, and let's assume that a shirt is a social good. Now, it takes roughly twice as much energy to produce a pound of cotton as it does a pound of nylon. This is a computation.
Have you got it mixed up?
I'm sorry, yes, the other way around. Twice as much energy to produce a pound of nylon as a pound of cotton. And incidentally, this is taking into account the gasoline going into the tractors, the fuel used to make the fertilizer and irrigation pumps and so on. For example, if you don't irrigate the cotton, it takes much less energy.
Right.
So at any rate, there is an fuel-burning air pollution cost attached to the shirt, which is greater if it's made of synthetic material than of natural material. And the physical reason is perfectly clear. The cellulose, cotton, is congealed solar energy. The nylon is made by burning fuel. Now, my point is simply this, that if, as we have every right to, we organize our society to provide shirts, we ought to know what the costs are, social costs in terms of air pollution and fuel depletion. And we ought to take steps in the direction of being thrifty. Now, if you then raise the question about air pollution and say, well, we've got to do something about it, and you look and see how much of that is due to this kind of mistake, then it becomes quite clear that there's no way of cleaning up air pollution until we reverse that trend. Now, that doesn't mean that...
Subject to the resources of the vat.
I don't know what you mean by that.
You see, I don't want to be inscrutable here. If in fact there is a problem involved in the sale of a nylon shirt that is not involved in the sale of a cotton shirt, for such reasons as you mentioned, isn't the best way, and isn't the intelligent way to regulate that problem, to charge extra for the nylon shirt on the grounds that there is a depredation involved in the manufacture of it?
Well, you know, I don't feel that that's where the problem lies. You see, there are various ways of dealing with that, and that's one way of doing it. It runs into some difficulties which are of a social and political nature. For example, people who are wealthy can then buy polluting shirts. And, you know, there are various ways of looking at it.
People who are wealthy can buy anything.
Right.
The point is that we want to discourage certain kinds of consumption. People who are wealthy can buy Cadillacs.
Right.
Poor people can't buy Cadillacs.
Right.
But
well, you know, you might think of this. Wouldn't it put a sort of extra moral burden on the rich to know that they're going around polluting the environment more than poor people?
No, for the reasons I gave you. The reasons I gave you are that the universe and the air can absorb a certain amount of that kind of thing.
No, but it can't. You see, for example, take the burning of fuel. There's no way of absorbing some loss of petroleum. You burn it, and it's gone. That's all there is to it. And there's no way of saying, well, we're not going to worry about that, you see. There's no way of doing that. And in the case of pollutants, it's generally true, too. Even if there were a sink, say somewhere off in the ocean, the poison's going to pass through the air on the way, and that's where it's going to hit people. But to get back to your question, we are going, I think, if we want to solve the environmental problem, we will have to return to the use of natural fibers, natural rubber, soap instead of detergents, simply because I don't see any way of using those synthetic materials without being in a situation where we are wastefully using up our resources in the air and in the sense of petroleum.
You're speaking as an ecological moralist.
Not
really as somebody
I didn't say what we should
situation.
do. I said, you know, if you remember, there's a very interesting difference between the British subway and the American subway. In the American subway, the signs say, "Do not interfere with the doors," right? The British subways, the sign says, "If interfered with, the doors, if doors are interfered with, the train will be inoperable." See? Now, one is an admonition, and the other is a piece of intelligence. Now, if you will read my book carefully, you'll see that with some slips, probably, I make no admonitions whatsoever, and I didn't make any right here. I said, if we want to clean up the environment, then, in my opinion, it will be necessary to do away with a good deal of the petrochemical industry. Now, if we don't want to, fine. Then there we go. And you see, I am precisely a non-moralist on these things. Now, we get into other areas, I'll moralize all you want.
Yeah. No, I think you're a moralist to the extent that you resist accepting the fact that a certain amount of nitrogen oxide and a certain amount of synthetic fibers and so on and so forth can be absorbed without really making anybody uncomfortable,
You seem to have...
except somebody whose aesthetic resentment over this.
What's wrong
like
with this
yours.
aesthetic resentment?
Not at all, but it's primarily a moral and subjective point.
No, you have invented something which I'd take a long time to straighten out, but this sink, you know, it's really not there.
Of course it's there.
It's just
It's
not
manifestly there.
And
If your grandson
you
pees into the
explain-
Hudson River, and that's the only thing that goes into the Hudson River over the course of that day, it is a substantially pure river. But
In
if
your
everybody's
opinion.
grandson does it at the same time, it isn't. It's just that simple.
No, it is not that
The
simple.
Hudson River will handle a certain
No.
amount of stuff.
No, it really isn't that simple. Because, for example, toxins become concentrated. And some poor crustacean off in the corner of the Hudson is going to suffer from my grandson's pee.
As
You know?
Henry Wallace said when they were eliminating the pigs, you would think each one of them was a pet.
That's right. Now, I
Your
think
favorite crustacean.
we've got an educational problem here with respect to that sink. Why don't we stipulate that we'll keep the
Okay.
sink out of this?
Well, all right.
Okay.
On the, in the same way that we instruct a jury to ignore it.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Right.
I think it'd be too complicated to straighten out. But in circles, there are no sinks.
Well, that's a circular argument. Now,
Yeah, I've avoided that particular quip for a long time. But you didn't. Go on.
well, let me get to, before we turn to the panel, to a couple of your generalities. Incidentally, while we're at it, as I understand it, you feel that the United States spends as much money as it does on the war machine simply because it chooses not to spend it on ecology.
No, I don't believe that at all.
Oh, good.
I never said it.
Do
Do you believe it?
No, but I don't know how else to interpret the following, which I quote from you exactly. Unless we give up our preoccupation with large-scale military activities, which since World War I have preempted most of the nation's disposable income.
Yeah.
As I understand it, our
Well,
preoccupation...
go on with the sentence.
That's all I copied down. Oh, no, well, all right, I will. I remember it by memory. The
Well,
rest was that you talked about Japan and Germany.
Unless we
what
do
Japan
that,
and Germany are able to do because they don't have it.
Right.
Now,
right.
but our preoccupation with the military is not a function of something other than our preoccupation with the sovereignty of this country.
Oh, absolutely.
Therefore, why don't you say unless other countries in the world cease so to behave themselves as to require us to spend a certain amount of material? Wouldn't that be a more judicious way of saying it?
In your opinion, yes. I think, the point I was making was fairly simple, that the resources involved in our military budget are so large that I don't see any way of dealing with ecological problems, urban problems, agricultural problems, any of the problems in the country. Really, we're simply being dogged by the fact, see, it's not just that the money is being diverted, it's that
Scientific...
well, and it's more than that. The Pentagon tells us what we can and cannot produce. Really. Take, for example, the thing we were talking about before, natural and synthetic rubber. Now, it's idiotic for us to be using synthetic tires for all the reasons I've described. What we ought to be doing is buying natural rubber tires from Malaysia. That would make good sense. Do you think the Pentagon would allow us to run our Army trucks on Malaysian tires?
I think the Pentagon ought definitely not to permit us to become dependent on Malaysia. That happened, if you will remember, in 1940-41.
Yes. Well, you see,
considerable anxiety during 1942-1943.
Exactly. But the whole point of that discussion is that if we hope to save the environment, we will have to become dependent on those parts of the world that can best produce resources in an ecologically thrifty way.
Well,
and
this is a dilemma then, because
that's right.
I hope you would, if President of the United States would not appoint as Secretary of Defense somebody who would superordinate the problems of ecology over those of national sovereignty.
Well, that is your hope. Mine is the reverse.
But why would you call him Secretary of Defense? Call him Secretary of Undefense or Secretary of Surrender.
Why don't we call him Secretary of Survival?
Well, because that's no. If you want
isn't that what defense is about?
If you want to subsume all executive agencies under one, you could call it Secretary of Survival.
No,
but some people, myself, for instance,
I mean, there's
say
survival and then the amenities and so on. But let's put it this way. Let's say that the purpose of the Department of Defense is to sustain, maintain, conserve our society from outside attack, right?
Correct.
In that sense, it's a Department of Survival. And as far as I'm concerned, the present policies of defense are simply a short-term, very short-sighted way of preparing for our ultimate demise. I mean, and this ranges all the way.
Well,
look, if we build up all the nuclear weapons
yeah.
that we have now in the name of defense, we're simply laying the basis for a catastrophic accident. You can't have that many bombs around.
I've been hearing this for 15 years, and there hasn't been an accident since I first heard it.
Yes, I know, but you know.
Let alone a catastrophic one.
Right, but the world will.
Oh yeah, there was that beach in Spain.
Right, but you know, 15 years is a short time after all. Not perhaps in your lifetime or mine, but there are other people.
Well, yeah, that's right. There are other people who are beneficiaries of the nuclear umbrella that we have held over large parts of the world. Among them Japan and West Germany, over which you are so enthusiastic as a result of the availability of their capital. By the way, the dirtiest river I ever saw was in China, but go ahead.
Right. Please don't say that I'm enthusiastic about Germany and Japan.
No, and you point out that Russia, that the Soviet Union has just as much.
No, the point I was making, we better get this clear, is that for our own sweet reasons, we forbade Germany and Japan to build up armies after the war. As a result, they had much more capital available for investment than we did, because since World War II, for the first time in the history of the United States, we diverted more than 1% of our GNP into the military in so-called years of peace. And the result is, as far as I can tell, that our economy has been strapped for capital investment. And that's one reason we're not getting those new engines.
But our percentage of, the percentage of our GNP devoted to the military has descended quite precipitately in the last 7 years. It's less now than it was when Truman was president.
That's right. But
much less than it was when Kennedy said that we were suffering terribly.
Right, but it's about 8 times higher than it was between World War I and World War II.
Well, it didn't exist. We used broomsticks at that point.
Well, that's fine. That's what I.
Yeah, that's fine.
Great.
Sure. If the other people will use rakes, I'd settle for broomsticks.
Yeah, you know, when I was a kid, I remember that anybody in uniform was sort of a rare bird, you know, between World War I and World War II, and the predominance of the military that's been developed in the last 25 to 30 years is, to me, an appalling thing.
I think it's an appalling thing too, but I think it's objectively required. It certainly isn't because people like Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson love the military. By the way, there are 1,200,000 people fewer military now than when Nixon took office.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's
good. Before, we really are going to the panel here, but you did say that unless the United States becomes committed to peaceful fraternization with the rest of the world, it will have neither the productive resources for its own ecological restoration nor the world's cooperation.
Right.
Now,
don't you believe that?
I believe that we are committed to peaceful fraternization with the rest of the world, but I believe that it is very hard to assume that the rest of the world is also committed to peaceful fraternization with us. All of that stuff that's sitting in Russia, whose only coherence is to land on a minute missile bases.
Like
certainly
ours on theirs.
No. Ours is not the first strike force at all.
It isn't?
No.
Really?
Well, smile, aren't you pleased? I just gave you a very good piece of information.
It's not true.
Yes, it is. All of our Minuteman missiles are not based at their, because that is only useful as the first strike point.
Well,
But what I'm simply saying is it's kind of silly to assume that unilaterally you can have peaceful fraternization.
no, I don't.
It's got to be a game of which two people play.
You know, my feeling is that the first thing we have to do in this country is get our own heads straight. And I think that the importance of really achieving peaceful relations in the world is something that we have yet to learn. And
I've learned it.
You have?
Who are you talking about? Sure. I think there's nothing more important at all. I think it's the most important thing, and the best way to do it, of course, is to neutralize other people's threat in order to diminish their appetite for imperialism.
It strikes me that we've been gratuitously belligerent.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do you call Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, the Bay of Pigs?
Preventive medicine. That's exactly what I call it.
Right. It's pretty sickening.
And I'm sure if you were Guatemalan, you'd call it too. I mean, I can stand the pacifist argument.
Yeah. No, it's not a question of pacifism.
Maybe we shouldn't have landed in France to help repel the Nazis. But there are arguments saying that that was definitely a bellicose act as far as the Free French, as far as the Quislings were concerned. But I thought it was.
But you know, in that case, we built up our force in order to meet the political obligation, which.
Yeah, we used to call it the arsenal of democracy.
Yeah, right. But we did it deliberately in order to carry out a political purpose. Impression I have.
Political purpose.
Yeah, right. And
Monroe Doctrine and so on.
We all participated in that and so on. The impression I have is that since the war, we have built up since World War II. I don't recognize undeclared wars. Do you?
Yes.
Oh,
I'm a realist.
Okay. You can call it that. Since the war, I have the impression that we have built up a fantastically destructive armament. And we're going around looking for ways to use it.
Well, I think it's naive. It certainly wasn't destructive enough to get rid of the North Vietnamese, was it? Well, I really don't think. Mr. Arthur Resnikoff is a counseling psychologist, Mr. Resnikoff.
I'd like to ask both of you how you think decisions about the environment ought to be made. For example, I think it was 3 summers ago there was a brownout in New York City, power shortage. In Messina, New York, in the same state, 2 aluminum companies were going full blast. Uses an awful lot of electricity. It seems like there's something fundamentally wrong with those kinds of priorities. I'm wondering how you'd go about changing those kinds of priorities, how things get mobilized.
Well, I think the first thing to do is to get the kind of information that leads to your question clearly in people's minds. And, you know, a few years ago, no one knew that aluminum was so costly in electricity. I guess I simply will fall back on an act of faith, really, that once there is a clear public understanding of what the options are, what the alternatives are, that a social mechanism will be invented to choose a useful option. And you see, that's one of the options. For example, another one is to do what the French do, which is to close the city down in August. Another option is...
Yeah, but they didn't do that because they were fleeing an energy shortage.
No, but that's all right. There's nothing wrong with it.
They wanted to go to the beach.
You know, history's great. What we should do is learn what people have done in other circumstances and try to adapt some of these things. So that's another thing. Another thing is to improve the efficiency of air conditioners so that they use less electricity. I really can't answer the question as to how I would go about doing it, because my own feeling is that what stands in the way of our accomplishing this thing is not that no one has invented some clever social or economic or political technique, but that the issue hasn't been squarely placed before the public. And that's where I think that's the hurdle that we have to overcome. I mean, take the business of the Penn Central. Do you think anybody has to invent nationalization of railroads as a way of solving that? You know, it's been done.
No, but
it was done in World War I. What is needed is to understand that the idiotic proposal that the Nixon administration has made is predicated on the notion that there shall not be social ownership of that railroad. So I think the issues lie one step before determining how to do it.
Well,
Your turn.
my comment is that above all, the decision ought not to be political. Obviously, if there's less power available than the people want to consume, you do need priorities of the obvious kind, hospitals, for instance, ought never to be deprived. Beyond that, there are a number of ways that I think are impartially administered and defensible. In Mexico City, they give you no electricity at all for 2 hours in the afternoon, between 3 and 5. In New York City, it may be that 3 and 5 would not be the hours that you wanted to cut down on the availability of electricity, but some other hours. When there's a shortage of water, as there was in New York City in 1965, the most sensible proposal was to meter it, so that people would bother to turn off their faucets. If electricity during particular hours, let's say air conditioning units at night, were to cost twice as much as during the day when they are genuinely needed, people would not be so careless as to leave them on. This is the kind of thing that, in my judgment, works in the reconciliation of these two things. The worst thing to do is to say to Congress or to City Hall or whatever, you figure out, as a result of your extensive intelligence, how to allocate priorities beyond, as I say, the obvious ones of hospitals. Ms. Susan Wedemeyer is coordinator of women's programs.
First, I'd like to ask Dr. Commenter to respond to that last thought. And why is it that you have such faith in the public to rely on social responsibility? It seems to me using more energy must be taxed higher. I don't understand why you can't rely on both. Why not tax the Cadillac owner?
Yeah,
alongside the red seal of conscience.
Right. I give you no scientific justification for any of this. It's a purely personal feeling. Obviously, I've been mainly concerned with, so to speak, the scientific background of what, in the end, will be social and political decisions. And the question keeps coming up, you know, what do you think we ought to do? And the thing that impresses me as I learn more and more about the technological and scientific background of these issues, what impresses me is how blind we've been to the consequences of our actions and to the alternative ways of doing things. And in a sense, what I'm saying is that it's hard to imagine that given the poverty of information and of alternatives laid before people, that the people of the United States have been maximally inventive about how to solve their problems. In other words, it just strikes me, you know, first things first, lay the problems out in a way that most people can apprehend, and the chances are solutions will be found. You see, if, let's say, you know, it was like some mathematical problem where all the theorems were laid out and everybody understood it and we're all scratching our heads and nobody was able to find a solution, I would say, well, what we need is some genius or some social invention that will give us the solution, because clearly everybody understands what the problem is and they're trying hard and haven't found a solution. It's the other way around. No one has seen what the problem is or what alternatives exist, really, except in a very limited way, and I'm not worried about solutions yet. Now, after as we explain all of these things, and as people understand it, if there are no solutions, I'll be surprised and chagrined.
Mr. Gerald Cormick is the Director of Community Crisis Center. Mr. Cormick.
if in fact the thing to do is to make people more aware of what their options are and what their trades are, you mentioned at the outset these environmental impact statements. And I think a lot of us assume that if an environmental impact statement is filed, it must be okay. I guess that isn't really true. And what happens to them? Is this an educational device?
Yeah, well, of course, it's very new. It's really very new, and it's hard to get across the enormous change that this has been. You know, 3 years ago, there was no way of finding out what environmental effect, let's say, a reactor proposed for an island in the Mississippi would be, without a team of physicists and biologists digging into it for themselves. Now, before they set up those plans, they'll have to file some kind of statement. And the data for it will have to be on file and so on. So this is already an enormous advance because it begins to give you the rudiments of an understanding of it. Surely, some of them are pretty bad, and the important thing is, though, that the legal requirement for a statement allows citizens groups to challenge what they regard to be a bad statement. For example, the Scientists Institute for Public Information that I'm connected with is suing the Atomic Energy Commission because, in our view, it has failed to file an environmental impact statement on the breeder program. The AEC...
You mean one that satisfies statutory criteria?
Yes, yeah, and it's in the courts now. They claim that they have filed one for a single reactor. We claim that they have to file one for the entire system that's involved in disposing of the wastes and so on.
So you simply become a compliance agency, in effect.
Yeah, but the important point about it is that, see, here they filed what we regard to be as an inadequate statement. But it allows us to get into the mechanism of perfecting it. One thing I should say is this. At a meeting in San Francisco a few months ago, a social worker there raised this point. We were talking about the effect on jobs. And really, what's needed is not just an environmental impact statement, but a social impact statement. What is the consequence on society as a whole? And that's the great virtue of it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kamler. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the panel, ladies and gentlemen of the audience.
For a printed bound copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250.